The first time I realized something was wrong in Bodie Ghost Town wasn't when I saw movement inside one of the abandoned buildings after midnight. It was when I noticed lights turning off inside structures that had no electricity anymore. You're listening to True Haunting Log, where we share real haunted incidents from real people around the globe, and if you've experienced something you can't explain, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Story 1. The Ghosts of Bodie. I work seasonal overnight maintenance near Bodie State Historic Park during late autumn, mostly checking fencing, monitoring weather damage, and making sure tourists hadn't crossed into restricted sections after hours. During daytime, Bodie feels like history frozen in place. Abandoned wooden storefronts, silent streets, empty homes filled with dust-covered furniture left exactly where people abandoned it decades ago. But at night, the town feels completely different. Once the tourists leave and the mountain wind starts moving through the empty streets, Bodie stops feeling abandoned. It starts feeling occupied in a way difficult to explain unless you've stood there alone after midnight. The silence never feels empty. It feels attentive. Most workers there avoid discussing the stories openly because every old mining town develops ghost legends eventually. But there was one warning nearly everyone gave me during my first week. Never stay too long inside the buildings after dark. Nobody explained why directly. They would just say things like, "The town doesn't like being watched at night." Then, change the subject. I laughed the first few times I heard that because abandoned places naturally affect people psychologically. Empty streets, isolation, wind noise. Your brain starts creating presence where none exists. At least that's what I believed then. The first strange thing happened during a patrol shortly after 1 a.m. I was walking near the old hotel section checking storm barriers when I noticed faint light moving behind the second-floor window of one of the abandoned buildings overlooking the main street. At first I assumed another worker was inside because the glow looked exactly like lantern light crossing slowly through a dark room. The problem was, nobody was supposed to be in that section after sunset. The building itself had been structurally unsafe for years. I remember standing there watching the light drift slowly across the upstairs hallway before disappearing deeper into the structure. Then, another light appeared in a different room further down the building. My radio crackled softly while I kept staring upward. "You seeing that too?" Another worker named Harris asked quietly over the channel. Hearing tension in his voice unsettled me immediately because Harris had worked Bodie nearly 6 years and normally joked about everything. "Probably trespassers," I answered. There was a long pause before Harris responded again. "That building's sealed from the outside." A cold pressure moved slowly through my chest after hearing that. I raised my flashlight toward the second floor, again, expecting to catch movement behind the windows, but the lights inside the building had vanished completely. Every upstairs window looked black again. "Stay on your route," Harris said quietly through the radio. "Don't go inside tonight." I almost listened to him. Honestly, I should have. But part of me still needed a logical explanation, so instead I crossed the empty street toward the hotel entrance while mountain wind pushed dust slowly along the old wooden boardwalks around me. The closer I got to the building, the stranger the town started feeling. Not dangerous, aware. Like the silence around Bodie had shifted its attention toward me specifically. The front entrance was chained shut exactly as Harris described. Thick, rusted lock, still secured across the doors. No signs of forced entry, no footprints around the windows, nothing. Then somewhere inside the building, directly above me, I heard footsteps crossing the second floor. Slow, measured, moving from one room to another. And beneath the sound of those footsteps, someone quietly humming to themselves in the dark. The humming inside the hotel stopped me cold because it sounded completely ordinary, soft and absent-minded, like someone moving through their home late at night without realizing anyone could hear them. That normality made it worse. If I had heard screaming or violent noises, my brain would have immediately treated it like fear, but the humming sounded familiar enough to feel wrong on a deeper level. I stood there beneath the dark windows, listening while slow footsteps continued crossing the second floor overhead, one room to another. Pause, then movement again. The wooden floors inside groaned softly beneath the weight, old dry boards shifting with deliberate steps that sounded far too heavy to be caused by wind alone. "You still outside the hotel?" Harris asked through the radio suddenly. I grabbed the mic without taking my eyes off the building. "Yeah," I answered quietly. "There's definitely someone in there." Silence followed for several seconds. Then Harris spoke again, in a lower voice than before. "Do the lights come back yet?" I frowned slightly. "What?" "Just answer me." I looked up toward the second floor windows again. At first, everything remained black. Then slowly, faint yellow light began appearing behind one of the far hallway windows upstairs. Not switching on suddenly like electricity, gradually brightening like lantern flame, moving closer from deeper inside the building. My chest tightened immediately. "Yeah," I whispered. Harris exhaled softly through the radio. "Leave the area." Before I could respond, the humming upstairs stopped completely. Silence settled inside the building for several seconds. Then one of the upstairs windows creaked open slowly by itself. The sound echoed through the empty street loud enough to make me step backward instinctively. A moment later, a woman's voice drifted down softly from the darkness above. "Are you staying tonight?" My pulse hammered hard enough to blur my vision for a second because the voice sounded close. Too close. Not distant the way someone speaking from a second-story window should sound. It felt like whoever spoke was standing directly beside me instead. I raised the flashlight toward the open window, but the beam only illuminated dust moving through cold night air. No face, no movement, nothing visible at all. "Who's up there?" I called out loudly. The silence afterward lasted just long enough to become unbearable. Then another voice answered from somewhere deeper inside the hotel behind the lit hallway window. "Nobody leaves after dark." The tone wasn't threatening, calm, matter of fact, like a simple rule being explained. Then footsteps started moving downstairs inside the building. Slow at first, measured, descending one floor at a time somewhere beyond the walls, while the lantern glow upstairs drifted gradually toward the staircase area. My entire body locked watching the building because even though the doors remained chained shut from the outside, the sounds inside continued getting closer to ground level. "Walk away now," Harris said sharply over the radio. For the first time all night, he sounded genuinely frightened. I finally started backing away from the hotel entrance without lowering the flashlight, and the moment I stepped off the wooden boardwalk onto the empty dirt street, every sound inside the building stopped instantly. No footsteps, no humming, no voices. Then the light upstairs vanished all at once. Complete darkness swallowed the windows again. The silence across Bodie afterward felt enormous. Wind moved slowly between abandoned storefronts while old signs creaked gently above empty streets. But underneath those normal sounds, something else lingered in the atmosphere now. Attention. The town felt aware that I had noticed it. Then, from somewhere far down the main road beyond the old saloon buildings, I heard more footsteps. Not one person, several, walking slowly through Bodie together. The footsteps moving through Bodie sounded wrong immediately because abandoned towns aren't supposed to carry echoes like occupied streets. Yet these steps traveled clearly between the buildings ahead, multiple people walking together at a slow, even pace, somewhere beyond the saloon row. I stood frozen in the middle of the empty street, listening while cold wind pushed dust across the ground around my boots. Harris stayed silent over the radio now, like he already knew what I was hearing. The footsteps continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly near the far end of town where the old mining road disappeared into darkness. Then, complete silence settled over Bodie again. "Get back to the station," Harris finally said quietly. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked. Another long pause followed. Then Harris answered in a voice that sounded more exhausted than frightened. "The town repeats itself sometimes." Before I could ask what that meant, static swallowed the transmission completely. I started walking back toward the ranger station after that, but the deeper I moved through Bodie, the stranger the town began feeling. The empty streets no longer seemed abandoned. They felt paused, like activity had stopped only moments before I arrived. I passed the old general store and noticed one of the upstairs curtains moving slowly behind the glass, despite the windows being sealed shut for decades. Further ahead, a rocking chair on the porch of another building shifted gently back and forth without wind touching it. None of the movements looked dramatic enough to feel supernatural immediately. That subtlety made everything worse. Then I noticed lights again. Different buildings this time. Faint lantern glows appearing behind dusty windows further down the street one by one while I walked. First the old barber shop, then a boarding house, then the second floor of the abandoned school building overlooking the road. My breathing tightened painfully because the lights weren't random anymore. They were appearing in sequence ahead of me, following my route through town. I stopped walking instantly. The lights stopped appearing too. For several seconds, nothing moved anywhere in Bodie except the wind. Then slowly, one of the lights inside the schoolhouse drifted toward the front window. A figure stood behind the glass. Human shape, motionless, watching the street below. I raised my flashlight toward the window instinctively, and the figure vanished the moment the beam touched the building, not stepped away. Gone. Then somewhere behind me, a door slammed hard enough to echo through the town. I spun around immediately. The hotel entrance behind me remained chained shut exactly as before, but now another building nearby stood partially open, the old saloon. A warm yellow glow spilled faintly through the doorway onto the dirt street outside. My chest tightened because that building had been completely dark only moments earlier, and from inside the saloon came voices. Quiet conversation. Glass shifting across wood. Someone laughing softly. The sound hit me harder than the whispering earlier because it felt normal, alive, like walking past an occupied business late at night in an active town. But Bodie wasn't active. It hadn't truly been alive in decades. "Don't go in there," Harris suddenly said through the radio again. His voice sounded strained now beneath heavy static. "You stay too long near the lights and the town starts pulling you into it." I stared toward the open saloon doorway while the voices inside continued casually, like people enjoying drinks after work. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices inside the saloon laughed softly and said my name. Not loudly, familiar, like someone expecting me to join them. Then another voice answered from deeper inside the building. "He's starting to recognize the streets." The moment the voice inside the saloon said I was starting to recognize the streets, a wave of dread hit me so hard I physically stopped breathing for a second because deep down I understood exactly what it meant. The town no longer felt unfamiliar to me anymore. The routes between buildings, the locations of the old shops, the shape of the roads cutting through Bodie in darkness. Somehow, without realizing it, the place had started feeling remembered instead of abandoned. The saloon doorway remained partially open ahead while warm lantern glow spilled across the empty dirt street outside. Voices continued drifting softly from inside the building, low conversation mixed with quiet laughter and the sound of glasses shifting across wooden tables. Everything about it sounded normal. That was the terrifying part. Not ghostly, not distorted, just ordinary people spending another night in town. "Walk away," Harris repeated sharply through the radio. "Right now." I should have listened immediately, but instead, I found myself staring toward the open doorway, trying to understand how an abandoned town could suddenly feel occupied without anything visibly impossible happening. Then another voice drifted from inside the saloon. Calm, male. You're late. My stomach tightened instantly because the sentence sounded directed at me specifically. Then footsteps crossed the saloon floor toward the entrance. Slow, measured, approaching the doorway from inside the building while the lantern light flickered against walls that should have been empty for decades. I backed away instinctively, just as a figure stopped inside the entrance beyond visibility. I couldn't see the person clearly, only boots near the threshold and part of a dark coat illuminated by warm light behind him. "Town's quieter than it used to be," the man said softly from the doorway, "but it still keeps people." Every muscle in my body tightened hearing that because his voice sounded completely real, not whispered, not supernatural, just tired, like someone speaking after a long shift. Then movement appeared behind him deeper inside the saloon. More people, shadowed figures seated around tables beneath lantern light, talking quietly among themselves while dust drifted through the room like smoke. Some looked toward the entrance, toward me. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. None of them looked surprised to see me there. It felt like they'd been expecting me to arrive. "Leave the lights alone," Harris said through static. His breathing sounded uneven now. "If the town starts recognizing you, it gets harder to leave." The figure inside the doorway tilted his head slightly after hearing the radio. Then softly he asked, "How long has Harris stayed here now?" A cold pressure moved through my chest instantly. "What?" I whispered into the radio. Harris didn't answer, only static. The figure near the doorway stepped slightly closer, enough for lantern light to partially reveal his face beneath the shadow of an old hat. Pale skin, dust-covered coat, eyes that looked exhausted more than dead. "Some people stop noticing when they never really leave," he said quietly. My pulse hammered violently because the sentence made no sense until I remembered something Harris once mentioned during my first week at Bodie. He had joked that after enough night shifts, the town starts feeling more familiar than the modern world outside it. At the time, it sounded harmless. Now, it felt like a warning. Then the radio finally crackled again, but the voice coming through no longer sounded like Harris. It sounded older, distant, like a weak recording buried beneath static. "Maintenance route complete," the voice whispered. The transmission cut out completely afterward. Silence settled across Bodie again, except for the soft conversation continuing inside the saloon. Then one of the seated figures further inside the room slowly turned toward me and smiled faintly. "Stay long enough," she said quietly, "and the town remembers you too." The moment the woman inside the saloon said the town remembers you too, I finally understood why nobody working overnight in Bodie liked discussing the stories openly. The fear wasn't about seeing ghosts. It was about staying long enough for the town itself to stop feeling abandoned. The figures inside the saloon continued their quiet conversations beneath lantern light, while dust drifted slowly through the room like cigarette smoke frozen in time. Some laughed softly. Others watched me from shadowed tables with expressions that looked strangely familiar, not because I recognized their faces, but because they carried the exhausted calm of people who no longer questioned where they belonged. The man near the doorway stepped slightly aside then, enough to reveal more of the room behind him. And for a second my chest tightened so hard it hurt because deeper inside the saloon I saw something impossible. A modern security jacket hanging across the back of one chair. Mine. Same reflective strip on the sleeve, same department patch. My mind struggled to process it while the voices inside continued normally around the room like nobody noticed anything strange. Then, another figure seated near the far wall looked toward me and spoke quietly. "You've walked the streets enough already." I backed away from the saloon entrance immediately after that, finally forcing myself to break eye contact with the light spilling into the street. The moment I stepped backward, the atmosphere around Bodie shifted subtly again. Not violently, more like the town itself becoming disappointed. The voices inside the saloon grew quieter, The lantern glow dimmed slightly, and somewhere further down the empty streets, footsteps started moving again. Several people walking slowly through town together beyond visibility. I turned and started walking quickly toward the ranger station without looking back. Not running, just moving fast enough that my boots kicked dust across the road while cold mountain wind pushed between abandoned buildings around me. The problem was the streets no longer felt arranged correctly. Buildings seemed farther apart than before. Certain intersections appeared in the wrong order. Twice I passed structures I could have sworn I'd already walked by minutes earlier, and every time I looked back over my shoulder, I noticed more faint lights appearing inside dark windows throughout Bodie behind me. The town was waking up. That's honestly the only way I can describe it. Not physically, psychologically. Like the longer I stayed there after midnight, the more the abandoned streets wanted to behave like a living town again. Then, somewhere behind me, a woman's voice called softly through the darkness. "Don't leave yet." Another voice answered from further down the street. "Most people stay longer." My breathing tightened while I kept moving forward without responding because the voices no longer sounded distant now. They sounded nearby, walking parallel through the buildings surrounding me. Then I saw the ranger station ahead at the end of the road. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost weakened for a second until I noticed something wrong immediately. The lights inside were off. Completely dark. That should have been impossible because Harris was supposed to still be there monitoring radio traffic overnight. I reached the station door and shoved it open hard enough to rattle the frame. Inside, the office sat empty beneath darkness and dust. No equipment running, no coffee still warm, no radio chatter. It looked abandoned. Not recently empty, long abandoned. A cold pressure crawled slowly through my chest while I swept the flashlight across the room and noticed old paperwork scattered across desks beneath layers of dust thick enough that nobody should have worked there for years. Then my flashlight stopped on a photograph pinned near the back wall. A staff photo, several maintenance workers standing together in front of Bodie decades earlier. Harris stood among them. Same face, same voice, same jacket. My pulse nearly stopped completely as I stared at the faded image because the date printed beneath the photograph was from over 30 years ago. Then the radio sitting silent on the desk suddenly crackled beside me. "You shouldn't stay inside after dark," Harris whispered softly through heavy static. I left Bodie before sunrise and never returned afterward. Officially, I resigned because of stress and isolation, which honestly wasn't a lie, but the real reason was simpler. Every night I spent there, the town felt less abandoned and more familiar. And eventually I became terrified that one morning I'd stop remembering there was ever another life outside those streets at all. Even now, years later, I still avoid ghost towns whenever possible, especially abandoned mining towns after dark, because some places don't stay empty just because people leave them behind. Some places keep repeating themselves quietly in the dark, waiting for enough footsteps to make the streets feel alive again. And sometimes late at night, when everything gets quiet enough, I still hear distant voices drifting through the back of my mind like conversation carried across an empty street by mountain wind, calm, familiar, waiting for me to come back and finish my route through Bodie. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to True Haunting Log so you never miss the next encounter. And if you've ever visited a place that felt occupied long after everyone left, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com and tell us in the comments what other ghost topic do you want to hear real stories about next.